Welcome to the Self Careapist podcast. Today, we are going to discuss perfectionism and individual and group psychotherapy interventions with Dr. Paul L. Hewitt, who is a full-time professor at the University of British Columbia, has published over 300 research papers, and the book Perfectionism, a Relational Approach to Conceptualization, Assessment, and Treatment. And he is the director of the Perfectionism and Psychotherapy Lab. Welcome to the Self Careapist podcast, Dr. Hewitt.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So glad to have you. So, did I miss anything that feels important to mention in your bio? I could have gone on.
I'm a clinical psychologist, so I also have a practice. So it's not just research that I do. So I'm a full professor and a practicing clinical psychologist.
How did you start your research on perfectionism?
It was truly when I was an undergraduate. I was in my third year of an undergraduate program. And in one of the courses, I had to do a paper. And I wasn't clear what kind of paper I would write for this course. And I was at, I think it was a dentist's office back in the days when they had magazines in offices. And so I was in the waiting room reading this magazine article, and the author of the article just mentioned something about being perfectionistic, and that it was kind of a difficulty for that author in writing the paper or writing the article that I was reading. And so I thought, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. Maybe I'll look and see if I could do a paper for this course. Essentially, that's what I did. But in writing the paper, I discovered that there were no studies on perfectionism. It was actually a construct that people had talked about for years, for decades, something important clinically and something that was related to lots of difficulties that people had. And so I wrote that paper. Then I did my fourth year honors thesis on perfectionism, my master's thesis, my Ph.D. dissertation. And then I've been publishing and researching and doing clinical work ever since then. So many, many years ago it started just with that.
Yeah, just noticing that there was a need that hadn't yet been met.
Well, there was also a bit of a personal connection to it as well, because I was studying music. In music, when you're training, very often sort of the ideas or the concept of perfectionism can enter in quite significantly, especially in classical music training and in particular. And so I had a kind of a connection to it. It just resonated with me that, okay, perhaps there's something here that is important.
Oh, yeah. That feels like an important piece. Do you pursue careers and passions that enhance perfectionism that already exists, or does it exacerbate those elements? What is the definition that you work with on perfectionism?
The way I understand perfectionism is it's really the requirement for the self or for others to be perfect or to appear perfect. We understand it as a personality style that's layered, that's complex, and it's multidimensional. Now, some people in the literature talk about perfectionism as being a set of attitudes or just ways of thinking. And we talk about it, and we've researched it as a more complex personality style that people have. So it affects all manner of their behavior.
Can you describe the difference? How did you come to understand it not as what the research may indicate?
Part of it came from my theoretical background in my undergraduate, graduate training, and then the work that I've been doing from a psychodynamic perspective. So coming from that perspective, we're always looking underneath, trying to understand behaviors that people have, problematic behaviors in particular, but it's not just that the behaviors are, we need to get rid of it. Really trying to understand what might be motivating or driving or pushing that behavior to exist and what purposes the behavior serve. So that was a big part of how we came to try to understand what perfectionism is. When I started really looking at this work, one stream in particular of the research was really trying to understand what perfectionism actually is. And I would read other people's work at that time, and they would call it a set of attitudes. That seemed way too simple and way too surface, because it's pretty clear that on the one hand, perfectionism is a simple way of being in the world. It's an attempt to try to perfect the self. But when you look underneath it, you start to realize that, okay, well, wait a minute. The perfectionism itself is not really the important issue. It's what's driving the perfectionism. And with that, what we're really talking about is a way for people who have some deficits, if you like, or have some thwarted needs that are unmet, a need to be acceptable to others, to be loved, to fit in the world, to matter to other people, and so forth. And so one of the ways that people very early in their lives try to meet those needs is they have a sense that, well, if I'm perfect, or if I try to be perfect, or if I appear to be perfect, then I will be acceptable to others. I won't be rejected, abused, abandoned. I'll be loved and cared for. So that's one piece. Another piece is that a need to have a sense of esteem for the self, a sense of feeling worthy in the world. So, I just talked about wanting to be loved, but then there's also wanting to be, to understand the self as a lovable self. And so there's these esteem needs and these affiliation or connection or relational needs that in individuals are not really met very well at all, most especially early in their lives. And as they continue to develop, they sort of learn ways, well, if I am perfect, then I will be loved and I will be lovable and I will have worth. It's a very elegant solution to a deeply painful problem, but it is a childlike solution in a sense, because it's a fantasy. And so even when I'm working with adults, and I mean seniors from early adults to late adults, people will say, we'll talk about, well, I know it's a fantasy. I will never be perfect. I can't be perfect, but I still am driven by this need to try to perfect myself in order to meet these other needs. Yeah. So it's a paradoxical kind of thing. People have this, well, maybe not so odd for humans to know, hey, it's not good to overeat. Hey, it's not good to go out in the sun without sunscreen, but I'll do it anyway. And so it's very consistent with human behavior that way. That's a very long answer to the question about how do we define perfectionism, or what is it? Mm-hmm. But essentially, that's how we understand a very broad way of being in the world that's trying to fix these issues of not being good enough to be loved or accepted or fit in the world, and not being good enough to have a sense of, I'm okay, I'm a deserving, worthy person.
Yeah, I think those two buckets, the love and safety bucket and the esteem bucket, are really important ways to think about the need that it's serving. Mm-hmm. Do you see that perfection goal as crossing environments? Is it perfectionism at school, at home, in my relationship, and so on? Or can it be more focused into one area?
People are so complex, and I think that's a really important thing to understand right from the start. Is I can talk about this construct and the definition of it, and in truth, it's way more important to talk about people who might have these tendencies or have this kind of personality style, and in the uniqueness of their life. If you think about what's at the core, is I feel unworthy and I feel I'm just not good enough for people to care for me. Now, I will try to fix that in a sense. I'm trying to deal with that in any sphere of life. So it could be all spheres, it could be some spheres, it could be certain spheres at different times. And it's not necessarily about, oh, I need to get an A in my course. Let me give you an example. I was referred a young man who was a university student, think it was about third year university student, who had been hospitalized for a pretty serious suicide attempt. Upon being discharged, it was going to be doing outpatient work with me, and was referred to me in particular because perfectionism seemed to be a big part of his behavior. I started working with this person, and he had returned to school. So it was at the end, toward the end of the school year. And one of the things in his program, there was one very difficult course. This was one of those defining courses. It's sort of for that program, if you do well in this course, then it speaks really well. You're going to do well in the field. And if you do poorly in it, well, maybe you should think about another direction. So very key.
High pressure, yeah.
Yeah, of course. And he wanted to get not only an A+ in the course, he wanted to have the highest grade in the course. So I had been working with him just for a few weeks, and not going to change that behavior in a few weeks, but was going into exams, and I saw him after I knew he would have gotten the grade for the course. He came into the session, you could tell immediately that the depression had deepened. There was a lot of despair that he was experiencing, and he sat down and did what I usually, what would you like to talk about today? And he said, well, I got the grade for the course. And I said, okay. And he said, I got the A+, and I even got the highest grade in the course. But, you know, I had to work so hard in order to get it that I had to just pressure myself and do so much. And because I had to do so much work to get that grade, it just illustrates that I'm not smart, I'm not capable, I'm just not any good at all. I'm still not good enough.
Yeah.
And that's a mechanism that we see again and again and again. It can be in a variety of domains, or it can be circumscribed to a particular domain, but it's at the core. The person is going to try to figure out some sort of way to try to correct these things about the self and their place in the world.
Yeah, there's some real cognitive distortion in there, isn't there, where discounting any positive, it's not real, it didn't prove anything because at my core, I'm still...
Yeah, you could call it a cognitive distortion, but I think that my way of understanding it is this person has this idea, if you like, or this strategy that is not a conscious chosen strategy. It's just a way of being.
Yeah.
And they have this idea that, okay, well, if I get this thing, if I am perfect, then finally I will be lovable, I will be loved, I will fit, I will have worth. And they perform, or they do some stellar thing, and they come away from it, and it doesn't change anything. And it's like, oh, well, I guess I wasn't perfect enough, or next time I have to do it. And what they don't do is change the fantasy. And the fantasy of, if I am perfect, then I'll be loved, then I will have worth. And failure after failure after failure, which is intriguing in and of itself, that person continues after failing, after being punished, continues the behavior. Again, sort of a broad answer to the question of, are there different domains? So anything can be chosen. A person it can be in their career, it can be in their relationships, and so forth. It's about trying to perfect the self to be lovable or have worth. These are powerful motivators or drives. They're powerful needs. So it's not just a thought that I have, oh, I should be perfect. It's way more powerful than thinking I should be that way. These people have to be that way.
What links do you make to attachment theory, or if you think about complex trauma, but what links do you make to those early experiences with attachment?
Attachment is sort of foundational. Attachment's kind of foundational to anything psychodynamic or psychoanalytic, absolutely. Place great importance on the development of perfectionism from very early relational experiences. And like attachment theory, those can come from very early days in the person's life to throughout the course of over the course of their development. So we often talk about, or in the model that we created, it's consistent with the non-attunement that you find in attachment. And we just call it asynchrony. It's just that what the child needs, the parent just is not able to kind of give what the child needs. Or the child has the sense that the parent is not giving what the child needs. And again, this is not conscious that people are, that these children, these infants are consciously making these choices and that sort of thing. But in that asynchrony, because a child's needs aren't met, we understand that, well, they do what children are supposed to do, which is to figure out how the world works and how I kind of fit and how I can navigate this world that I live in. And with that asynchrony or non-attunement from attachment terminology, there's two effects. One is the child learns working models of others, that others are incapable of meeting my needs. They're unwilling to meet my needs, or they don't have the capacity somehow to meet my needs. And so they come to understand others as these powerful entities that they can't get what they need, whether it's safety, a sense of comfort, mostly safety and comfort at that level. So one effect is it produces attachment anxiety, potentially attachment avoidance, but also these working models of other people as just not able to give me what I need, but having the power or being the source of what I need. The other effect, which comes from self-psychology, Kohut's work, essentially, where not only to develop working models of others as incapable of meeting needs, develop a sense of self as being fragile, defective, there's something wrong, fundamentally wrong with me. And so they develop this sense of a deficient sense of self. And so those two pieces come together. And, when you think about complex trauma and sometimes descriptions of outcomes of complex trauma, people talk about a lack of self-esteem and relationship problems, and among other things as well. And that's true, but we talk about it more in detail about these are fundamental. It's some of the most basic human needs that we are trying to meet are thwarted in early development. As humans, when we're in pain or distress, we don't just sit with the pain. We try to do something about it. We try to avoid it, or we try to figure out ways to make it better. And somewhere along the line, the child comes to understand that if there's a possibility that if I'm perfect, then my family will care for me, or they'll meet my needs. Or if I'm perfect, then I will have a sense of worth. And so they kind of learn this. Again, it's not a cognitive thing that they learn. They don't learn this strategy, but they come to understand that there's the promise of this need fulfillment if I do these certain things, if I can be perfect or appear to be perfect. So that's how attachment and self-psychology models are kind of infused in our model of how perfectionism develops.
Yeah, when they're coming to learn it, just some context. I work in my practice with a lot of high achieving entrepreneurs and things.
Sure.
And so some of your work is woven throughout those conversations sometimes, I believe. And it sounds like when someone's coming to learn that lesson, it might be, to use your great example from earlier, like, oh, you got A minus. Why didn't you get an A plus?
It's such a great example you gave there, because if you sort of think for a minute, what is the message that's being, it's not necessarily the message that's intended to be sent, but from a child's perspective, what does a child learn from that? One, yes, I should get the A plus next time. But it also said, well, not only was that not good enough, I'm not good enough.
Yeah.
And because, as you know, with children, it's not, oh, my behavior was bad, that's why I was punished. I have worth and I'm okay. No, children don't do that,
Yeah.
right? So if there's a punishment or a sense of not being good enough, that's kind of what we're talking about. That it's not the behavior wasn't good enough, or let's figure out a way to structure your study time so that you can do things better. No, it sort of hits deeply for them. And if you work with high achieving people, as do I do as well in my practice. Not everybody in that domain, but again, it's my practice, so it's a selected group of high achieving
Yeah.
people, from Olympians to professional athletes, etc. These issues are there for people. And on the one hand, if they happen to be very intelligent and creative and just have gifts, they can be very successful in those domains, but it doesn't necessarily touch that sense of not being good enough or not having worth or being acceptable. Everybody else in the world can say, wow, that's just stunningly amazing what you've accomplished. I worked with one person in particular who talked about he had a cardboard box in his office that he would just throw plaques and awards that he would win into this box, almost like it wasn't a waste basket bar, but almost totally meaningless to him. And he would just throw them in there, and it couldn't and didn't touch that sense of not being worthy.
Yeah. The punchline is it was never about any of that, but it feels like,
No.
when you're setting out to do it, it's like you're choosing things that might make a dent. And then ultimately the punchline is they don't, because it wasn't about the plaque.
Yeah, it's the wrong tool to use. It's the wrong tool to use to try to have a sense of being lovable and being loved, or connected with other people, or fitting in the world, or having worth. It's just not the
Yeah.
right tool.
So I liked that analogy about the tool because I don't know, it feels empowering that they picked a tool. It's just starting to understand
Yes.
that the
Oh,
tool wasn't the right one.
I absolutely. I mean, it's an elegant solution to these
Yeah.
deeply human problems there from the start. And I mean, I think if an adult, a rationally thinking adult, realized, oh, okay, I don't have worth, or, I don't feel like I belong or fit, they're probably not going to choose, well, I need to be perfect in absolutely everything I do. And that's the solution to an adult probably wouldn't do that, because they kind of have a sense that yeah, that's never going to happen. But a child
Mm.
does not have the experience to have an understanding that, okay, that's just not a very good strategy here, right? And in fact, if they are motivated by that, they may actually get reinforcement or praise for actually doing that stuff. So they may feel like, okay, well, I'm on the right path here. I,
Hmm.
I still don't feel good about myself, but I'm on the right path.
Yeah, for that second, I was achieving some praise, or the a disruption that was happening did stop for a minute when I unveiled this progress
Yeah.
I'd made, and that felt like I'm moving in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was a really neat statement that you just made about how an adult might see the logical, that it's not logical or actionable, but that for a child, it really is a really civilized path to try and select to
Sure.
problem solve.
When the child starts that, there's a sense of safety from it.
Hmm.
Like the promise provides some comfort, and the promise of the acceptance is really very, very powerful. And the reason I say that, and the importance of the childhood stuff, is because you learn all sorts of things to feel safe as a child, like looking both ways before you walk across the street. We learn that very, very early. When you all of a sudden so always turn into an adult, you don't say, oh, I need to rethink this a bit, and I need to make sure that, okay, is looking both ways, is that really going to be safe? We don't do that. We've pick up these behaviors in our childhood. We just carry them through. You don't, as an adult, read differently all of a sudden than you read a week before or a year before. No, we just continue on with it. And so if you're operating in this fashion about this is the way, this is the promise of safety, this is the promise of good things happening to me, we don't evaluate it until maybe a person starts to work with you, for example, and you say, hey, well, let's look at this thing. Is this really, let's really put this on the table and have a look at it. And it's at that point that hopefully people can sort of get a perspective on it and say, well, yeah, maybe this isn't the greatest approach, but then it's not simply flipping a switch and they don't do it anymore. No, you're talking, the equivalent I say is, I mean, sort of a silly example, but if I walked out on the street with you and I said, okay, Lorraine, you're going to have to trust me on this. I want you to close your eyes and I'm going to get you you just walk across that 3 lanes of traffic there. And you're going to say, no way, that's way too dangerous. So it's kind of the equivalent of that, of trying to help people get to a place where they can do things differently that felt so dangerous, or they feel so vulnerable with it that they have to sort of trust that there's a path there. Sometimes I sort of make the analogy in working with people in therapy with these issues. The task is kind of one where we're going to take away some, or work on taking away some ways of being in the world for these individuals that have provided a sense of safety for them. And if the safety is in the possibility of something good happening if I'm perfect and something bad not happening if I'm perfect. And essentially we're talking about those needs. And so it would be analogous if I took you to the side of a busy street right now and I told you to close your eyes and just walk across. You would not do that. You would strenuously object to doing it because you have the sense that that's a really dangerous thing to do and I'm not going to do it. And it'd be very appropriate, of course, of you not to do that. However, in this other domain, it becomes an issue. Okay, well, how can we help the person actually get to a place to see that, okay, there may not be such danger in not being perfect, in not appearing perfect. And one of the real challenges, and one of the things I think about really is, I think perfectionism is less about trying to be perfect and way more about trying to ensure I am not imperfect. And that driving force is really quite powerful. And so it's the danger that's inherent in being imperfect. I think that is so paralyzing for people, or so destructive for people. So it's to help them get to a place where they can do that. And the therapy context is a perfect place to do that.
It almost sounds in that way, because I do think that language is really powerful. It almost sounds like the goals of exposure and response prevention for someone with obsessive compulsive disorder, that to a client there, it may feel like you're asking them to do something that feels at its core unsafe. Do you see any links in the research between obsessive compulsive personality disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder and perfectionism?
People have talked about that, even the DSM. I'm not a big DSM fan.
Okay.
Just to put that out there.
Yeah.
Talk about perfectionism being a part of it. And there's been people over decades who have tried to look at research with that. And at least the way we talk about perfectionism is not connected to OCPD or OCD. Now, one of the conceptual pieces with perfectionism, and a lot of the perfectionism work that started, was people were assuming that organization and hyper-conscientiousness, that's perfectionism. And we're saying, no, that's hyper-conscientiousness. That's different than perfectionism. And so I think the organizational pieces, that sort of stuff, the gaining relief from anxiety by having things organized and straight and just in a compulsive kind of fashion it's a different thing. It's this, just like striving for excellence is a completely different thing than perfectionism. Sometimes some people have accused me of trying to create a world of couch potatoes. Um, and I think, well, no, not really, because I highly value high standards, unrealistic I absolutely am a proponent of that. But when the point of all of that is to try to correct a sense of defectiveness or a sense of I don't belong in this world, then we're talking about something very, very different. And even the research, when people have looked at, measures of OCPD, for example, and looked at, and it's not really a piece of the same construct. So I think if people they're called perfectionism, the organizational piece, which another researcher was by the name of Randy Frost, who very early on in the process of his research trying to understand what perfectionism is, rejected that, organization, that sort of rigidity, that's not a piece of what this personality style is. It's something different.
Yeah. In your screening or assessment process, what really indicates to you that a goal-oriented, highly conscientious person isn't going to be identified as a perfectionist? What maybe language or what cues are you picking up on?
That they can, for example, have a sense of satisfaction from performance. So if they do really well, they can feel, okay, this was good. They get a sense of satisfaction. They don't just immediately indicate, oh, well, it wasn't good enough. It was irrelevant. It doesn't have any meaning for me. I need to do even better next time. That's one piece in particular that I think is relevant. So that piece about the performance having an effect on the person's esteem or having an effect on the person's mood, yes, but I think everybody in the moment that they get good feedback is going to feel okay or feel good. For the people we identify as very perfectionistic, it's either not there or it's so fleeting that it's almost the same as not being there, that they're just not there's no impact of the performance on their sense of self.
Yeah, that's understandable. What about the folks who can't get started? They're gathering the perfect equipment, they're building the perfect tools, and they can never get started or get that first product across the finish line.
It's a vulnerability piece. At some point, a person has to kind of put themselves out there. You see this especially, I work a lot with different kinds of artists, and you'll see it really problematic with artists. I studied music, and one of the things about when you study voice and singing is, especially if you're just on your own, you're out there, it's you, it's only you, and when you perform, it's not just the behavior you're presenting who you are. Like, it's a very naked kind of experience, and it's a vulnerable sort of experience. And if people don't have a comfort with that vulnerability, they're never going to take that risk.
I did want to ask you if you wanted to explain what your concern with the DSM is.
Oh, the DSM is, okay, I've got a whole huge lecture I do on this, so I got to condense it here. The DSM is a descriptive classification system, which means that disorders are simply groups of symptoms that kind of hang together, and symptoms that hang together are given a name. The name simply specifies, oh, it's these symptoms that are there together. Now, symptoms are are great, except from different perspectives, from certainly a psychoanalytic and psychodynamic perspective, but also research domain criteria, like from NIH, talk about symptom-based disorders. That's where you start when you're trying to understand things like health problems or disease entities or disorder entities. You kind of start with the descriptive piece. What's most important is looking underneath as to what's causing the existence of the symptoms. And that's where you need to be doing the real work of trying to be helpful.
Dr. Hewitt, one of the things we were talking about is how the perfectionism often begins as a fairly young child for many people.
Yes, yeah, it can start quite early for children. The model is similar to based on an attachment kind of perspective, and very early when the child is learning about relationships with other people, relationship with the self, how to create safety, how to navigate the world with safety. Well, the child will learn many adaptive and healthy things normally. They can also learn that they have a sense that they can't really count on other people. Other people are not available to them to care for them, or they're hurtful to the child in some sort of fashion. And the child learns that they can't really depend on other people. So those are called working models, which is from attachment theory. So working models of others as incapable or unwilling to provide support or care or love, and also a sense of feeling flawed and defective.
What is often bringing somebody to therapy? What are some of the signs for someone later in life that it's time to seek support for this set of concerns?
Well, very often it's the outcomes of the perfectionism that produce the difficulties that are produced that bring the person into treatment. Mm-hmm. So certainly depression, anxiety, relationship problems, a deep sense of not having a sense of esteem for the self, not able to meet some of the goals that they have in their life, relationship problems, the usual thing that brings people into treatment. Those would be the same kinds of things. There will be people who will kind of learn about perfectionism and realize that potentially this is a problem for that individual. But the problems aren't necessarily with the perfectionism itself. It's the outcomes of the perfectionism that are difficulties that would bring somebody in.
Yeah, so it sounds like for some people, maybe they can get by with, but would you say it's a majority of people that ultimately the outcomes impact them enough to seek treatment?
I've come to learn over the years that there are a lot of people who have suffered for a long time, not really knowing what it is or why it is that they feel awful. People will come in at different times in the process. And of course, not everybody with perfectionism is going to seek treatment. Sometimes they'll seek other ways of trying to help themselves. So I see people at all different ages, from children to seniors, who come in for therapy and treatment.
Oh, I didn't realize you treated the whole life
Yeah, the whole age
span.
range. Yeah.
Yeah.
I myself don't specialize with children. I myself don't do therapy with kids, but I have some of my graduate students who are working with children, and of course some of the people that I've trained over the years have gravitated more to working with kids with perfectionism or adolescents with perfectionism. So.
Yeah. What are the tenets of the treatments that you do and you teach for perfectionism?
It's a traditional kind of psychotherapy, a psychodynamically based treatment approach. And the idea is, from a psychodynamic perspective, we don't really pay much attention to symptoms or surface related kinds of behaviors. We're always interested in what's causing the existence of the symptoms or the problematic things that people are having difficulties with. And so the treatment tends to focus on some of those deeper relational needs that produce the perfectionism. So we talked a little bit about the developmental perspective where people have these thwarted needs to belong. They don't fit in the world. They're not acceptable, have a sense that they're not acceptable to other people. And they have a sense of themselves as being deeply flawed. Those are the things we tend to direct ourselves to in the treatment, is we want to work at the level of the relational needs. So sometimes when people, I've done a few video demonstrations for the American Psychological Association, for example, and then other videos we show in my workshops. And people often are surprised that I don't talk about perfectionism very much at all. Maybe right at the start, just a little bit, because that can be a component of bringing people in. But then we're not talking about perfectionism. People have been told 1,000 times, don't be so critical of yourself, don't be so perfectionistic, don't be so hard on yourself. And I'm just going to be another person to say that to them. So there's no magic number or any power of my words to tell people not to be perfectionist. That's going to do anything. So rather work on the underlying causes, which would be at that relational level.
So in terms of why the psychodynamic approach resonates with this work, one core element sounds like that relational piece between individual and therapist,
Yes.
and how it's reflected in that relational need that your client may have.
Yes. So we try to first off identify the patterns, relational patterns that the person is exhibiting in order to try to meet those needs. And essentially, people have the sense that I don't feel acceptable to others. I'm not good enough for other people not to abandon or reject me or to care for me. But if I'm perfect, then that will be the route to gaining acceptance and caring from other people. And so we look at sort of the patterns that people exhibit in terms of how they do that in their relationships. And we try to identify where that first arose in early relationships, how it's reflected in current relationships, that same pattern, and then importantly, how that's reflected in the therapeutic relationship. And it's when we start to see the perfectionistic behavior or the attempts to try to meet those needs within the therapeutic alliance that's when we work in the here and now of that relationship. So looking at that. And it's a very experiential kind of therapy. So it's not about teaching, it's not about training them new skills or anything. It's about having experiences within the therapy itself. So within what we call transference or the countertransference responses within that relationship.
I know that this question is irritating or just challenging for many of us, but can you give a sense of how long some of these therapeutic relationships tend to last?
For people who are quite perfectionistic, I mean, I've seen people for long periods of time, and I've seen them for relatively short. So I would say I would be looking at about a year. The research tends to suggest that irrespective of the kind of psychotherapy that's being done, just in general, you really don't start to see really significant clinical change until about the 30th, like around on average, the 30th session. So we're talking about in general, you don't see change in people until they've been in treatment for 5-6 months. That would be very consistent with what the treatment that we engage in, certainly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, I mean, a year, I've seen people I've seen people for many years, but the majority of people probably within a year, they make pretty significant changes in their life. So.
Yeah. For the workshops that you offer, what does that training process look like? How long are they?
These are training workshops for clinicians,
Yeah.
professionals. I mean, there's a series of them that we do. The first one is to try to educate people, clinicians, first off, on what perfectionism is and what it is not, and sort of the developmental models, and really have them gain a sense of this personality style and the importance of that personality style. So the first 8 hours of the training in the workshops deals with just teaching them about this personality style, where it comes from, how it's manifest, how we create a clinical formulation, meaning in the treatment that this is not a manualized, session 1 we do X, session 2 we do Y. This is very much a psychodynamic model where we work with each individual to try to understand how that individual functions. And so we create a fairly extensive clinical formulation. So it's a model of how this one person functions, how their perfectionism works, what they're trying to do with their perfectionism, and then all the other strengths and vulnerabilities that they have in the whole individual. And then when we've got this model of the person and how we believe they function, that guides us in the treatment that goes forward. So every treatment, every psychotherapy case that we have is different. So it's very idiosyncratic and tailored to the individual.
Can you determine from this formulation that there are still elements to work on, even though it doesn't look like perfectionism after all? Like maybe it doesn't meet your clinical understanding of what perfectionism is, but there are still elements in your formulation that can be worked on with your therapy.
Yeah. I do this with every kind of psychotherapy that I do, not just when we're talking about perfectionism.
Yeah.
It's particularly helpful for, I'll say, anything that's relational. But from my perspective, pretty much every psychological issue that brings somebody into therapy is relational. And so we've created this model of how to do a clinical formulation that we use and I use in all of the work that I do.
That's one of the most exciting parts about getting to talk to different experts. I think the screening and assessment pieces that different people are integrating is so amazing, because I think a lot of the different training across modalities, like you mentioned, some really lack that formulation piece.
Absolutely, they do. And instead, you asked me before about the DSM. And one of the difficulties with that kind of classification system, which is a descriptive classification system, is the diagnosis supposedly determines what the treatment is. And so the idea is, if you have disorder X, then there is a particular treatment you give for disorder X. And this is entirely opposite to that. This is doesn't matter what the disorder is, it's going to be experienced differently for every single individual. And it's not the disorder per se, that's the problem. The disorder or the symptoms are saying there's something deeper that's going on that's producing the symptoms. And it's the clinical formulation, again, that guides us in terms of where we go with the treatment.
Yeah, I like that idea that there isn't a standard protocol. You're really tailoring it to each individual based on their unique needs, presentations, etc. So it sounds like what you were saying is you have different lengths of workshops where you train this.
Yes, sorry. So the first workshop for clinicians is to try to train them about the concept of perfectionism and what it is, where it comes from. And then we spend quite a bit of time with just sort of teaching them about the formulation and why we use formulation. In today's clinical world, there are many, many clinicians who don't think this way. They haven't been trained to look underneath to try to understand the complexity of the person and how the person in all their different dimensions have an impact on both their healthy way of living, but also maladaptive or unhealthy ways of living. And so to get to that, we have to spend some time kind of training people that way. That's what we do in the first level of the workshop, is train people on formulation. The second level involves more specific working with actual patient material and with the formulation to get people used to kind of thinking in a very different way and putting together models of how they believe these particular patients work. And that's based on patients from that have come through my lab that have participated in treatments, and will give them all the assessment material in a clinical interview that one of my students or one of my colleagues have interviewed the patients, and then work with them so they can get a sense of how to create this formulation. And then sort of the third level is how do you take that information then and what do you do with it in a treatment context? And so then we work on the treatment elements being guided by the clinical formulation. So, and that takes a little bit longer, and then working with them on video material from treatments that we've engaged in, so they get to do that. And then there is another level, a more consultation level, where if people have their own patients, either I will consult with them, working with them individually, potentially, on a patient that they might be seeing in their own practice, or a group of clinicians. And I will do that. And my colleague, Dr. Samuel McHale, who was very instrumental working with me in developing the treatments. So those are the workshops that we do, the various levels of trying to train people about the personality style, but then about how to do the treatment of it as well.
Yeah. Are the workshops, maybe they differ, but are they multiple day workshops?
Yes. Yeah. So they're about 6 to 7 hours long. So there would be the whole suite of them would be 4 days, full days.
Yeah.
But they could be broken up into shorter bits for whatever people are interested in.
Yeah. And are they live and virtual, or are they on demand?
They're both. They're on demand, but I do both training in person, but also will do online groups, because we have people all over the world who are interested in being trained in this. So we'll do it over Zoom with people. But I also work quite a bit in Europe and Italy, and each year I do a workshop series in Italy each year. So.
Oh, how neat. You mentioned that you have students that work in your lab. How have you found your model as a foundational model for interns?
I do have some interns, but I also have graduate students and practicum students. I mean, this may be biased because the students usually are interested in working with me and what we're doing. They love it, especially love the idea of working in a deep way with patients. And for some of the more senior students and interns, I don't know how many times I've had people come to me and say, this was why I went into psychology, to study this depth stuff, and I've not had anything until now. And so I hear that again and again. So a lot of students and a lot of professionals out in the community are also, when they hear about the way we do this, and when they hear just what standard psychodynamic therapy is, they get very excited and think like, okay, well, no, this is the piece that I needed. This what drew me into this field in the first place. So it's very exciting when you have students get that excited about this stuff, and then it makes it easy to work with them and teach them. So.
Yeah. Well, I hear so much from my students or the people that I supervise that they really want to know that they're doing something. They really want to know that they're providing the service, like you're saying, that they set out to provide. So it's always neat to hear what models are eliciting those responses of confidence, right, from students.
Yes. Well, and I think that student therapists and therapists in general are often really driven by having like a human kind of connection with people, and see the power of that connection in terms of helping the individual. So the treatment is not just about getting rid of symptoms that the person has, or even getting rid of the perfectionistic behaviors. It's about the deeper stuff, about trying to increase the person's quality of life, their quality of relationships with others, the quality of the relationship they have with themselves. And that's so much more than simply getting rid of symptoms that a person might have. Symptoms of depression. Yeah, it's great to get rid of those. That's great. But we try to go way deeper than that in terms of trying to address the vulnerabilities to that depression, to lessen the occurrences of depressions that might occur in the future.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. As we're talking about just some of these elements, the workshops, I also wanted to mention and just discuss a little bit the book that you wrote on perfectionism,
Yeah.
which is very relevant because your paperback version is
Oh,
just
yeah.
coming out this month as well.
Yeah. Just came out a couple of days ago, actually. So.
Yeah. What was the process like writing the book?
Actually, it was a wonderful process because my co-authors are both really brilliant people. I mentioned Samuel McHale. He and
Hmm.
I were actually graduate students together, and so we were trained in the same program, and we have very similar ideas about doing psychodynamic work and that sort of thing. And so doing the book was lovely, just because we're writing about clinical stuff.
Yeah.
And you can probably sort of guess that even though I'm an academic and do research, my real love is the clinical work and working with people.
Yeah.
So that part of the book was wonderful. And my other colleague, Gordon Flett, is a personality psychologist. So he comes at the issues from a different perspective. But it was quite enjoyable to write the book because we were able to kind of bring in a lot of the clinical experience that we have. And I should say, along the lines of being both a researcher and a clinician, if I have done anything creative in the field of perfectionism, it's come from working with patients. I mean, it's really kind of simple. If you listen carefully to what your patients teach you about them, and you listen to a lot of them and you see these patterns, you just write them down, what the patients are teaching you about perfectionism, for example. You just write down what they're teaching you, and everybody thinks you're this wonderfully creative psychologist who came up with these great ideas. Not really. I just listened carefully and sort of put it together and then did research on what my patients were telling me. It's been very, very fruitful that way. All of the success of anything that we've done to the patients that I've worked with who've taught me about perfectionism, about therapy, about how to do therapy. So,
Yeah, it's so important. That's a piece in our research that isn't always present. And so it's really neat to hear from someone like you who's doing both and has those important links to the work that they're doing. You really enjoy it.
yeah, it's a little bit rare in the clinical psychology world in North America. Rare to have both academic and clinicians, doing both
Yeah.
activities. So, but I think it certainly enriches the research.
Yeah, I would agree. As we start to close down a bit, are there any elements that you think are important for clinicians listening that think they may have clients who are identifying with some of these points we've discussed?
If you believe that you have patients that are, exhibiting the perfectionism, but also other pernicious personality styles like the narcissism, dependency, those sorts of things, I think with the perfectionism, if you look at some of the material we've written about, first of all, how we conceptualize perfectionism, but the next thing would be about how it develops. And I think when you look at how we talk about the development of perfectionism as a clinician, you will immediately see, oh, okay, this is how I can intervene. This is what I need to do. This is showing up in the treatment and the interactions that I'm seeing. And very often people who read the book will come back to me and say, yeah, it's that chapter. And I thought it would be too, but it's that chapter that really sort of helps the people understand what's going on underneath for these folks. So that would be an important piece. I guess the other piece I would say is that sometimes when you're working with perfectionistic people, clinicians for the first time are kind of shocked at the depth of the pain that's there for these people.
Yeah.
And if you think about they've lived, that their life pretty much has been lived with a sense that I can't connect with other people. I don't sort of fit with other people. I don't have a place to belong, which is a horrific state to live in. But
Yeah.
at the same time, they also have a sense that there's something deeply flawed and defective about me. And those two pieces mean that these individuals have often lived with an incredible level of pain over the years. And so once you start to get beneath the surface of some of the symptoms, you start to get access to that pain. And sometimes clinicians are a little bit, ooh, I didn't know that that was that powerful for that.
Yeah, I mean, it shows maybe the power of the mechanism that it hides how deeply that pain resides with the person because they're presenting as so put together or
Oh, you hit on a really, really important piece, which is that it's not always about being perfect. It's often about just trying to appear perfect, that is, hide
right.
or
Yeah,
conceal that flawed, defective self
yeah,
from the world. If I hide it from people, then they'll care for me. And so they live this concealing kind of lifestyle and not feeling authentic, not feeling genuine. And I know you've worked with students in training and you see the imposter syndrome a lot, and you'll see it with professionals. And very often for these folks in particular, they live this life of, I seem to be doing these things, but it doesn't fit. It doesn't touch that deep sense of flaw and defectiveness. So I feel like any day somebody's going to discover that I shouldn't
be
be doing this.
exposed.
I'm a fraud. I'm an imposter.
Yeah, I'll be exposed in my
Yes.
flawed nature.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, just my closing question I like to ask everybody is how do you care for yourself to be able to provide all of this
Oh,
work to your clients? And I have a hunch that there might be a relational element there for you.
sure. Well, that is a big piece of it is to figure out things that I try to figure out things that I have a passion for, and usually that involves other people in some sort of fashion. So that's a big part of the self care. Can I add one thing I just thought
Please.
of? Some of the research we're doing right now, I did a study a few years ago showing that patients with perfectionism going into just any kind of treatment, their perfectionism interferes with their ability to benefit.
Yeah.
And you're nodding your head, so you've seen that or you understand it
It
immediately.
makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And it really interferes with their ability, especially to form a therapeutic connection with the therapist. Some of my students and I did some of this work and we published it, and we thought this is really, really powerful because not only does perfection create a vulnerability for these problems, when they actually seek help, it interferes with their ability to benefit. Well, one of the next steps, of course, was, well, in individual psychotherapy, there's two people involved. Does the perfectionism of the therapist, and absolutely perfectionism is a personality style that a lot of therapists can resonate with, but does the perfectionism of the therapist interfere with treatment outcome? And so we've started a project looking at perfectionism in therapists and quality of the therapeutic alliance, the nature or the tendency to have certain kinds of countertransference responses to patients, to feel criticized, to not feel good enough, to feel like an imposter. These are in the therapists. And do those things interfere with the ability have a
Mm.
good treatment outcome? And we're showing at this point, absolutely, that the perfectionism seems to be associated with factors that would interfere, including that therapeutic alliance, that it really interferes with the ability to form that powerful bond that's such a healing component of the treatment.
Wow. What a catch. What a path to take because that wouldn't have been intuitive to me, but it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, to look at just, and it's not that the perfectionism personality style is pathological in and of itself. It's just a personality style. But
Yeah.
there are elements of it that can really interfere in the work we're trying to do with patients. And so we've started that work, but also starting to do some kind of training with student therapists. who have perfectionism as an issue. And if you've done clinical supervision, you see it all the time. And to try to figure out ways to actually work with students who are perfectionistic and not just saying to the student, oh, don't be so perfectionistic. I mean, sure, that's like, it's silly. But to actually be able to work with them in the clinical supervision so that the perfectionism may not have as much of an impact. And truly, and this is one of my soapboxes, is if you're going to go into the field and be a therapist, you need to be doing therapy yourself. You need to be in therapy yourself. And I don't mean to get rid of depression or anxiety. I mean to explore, to come to know yourself, to really sort of free yourself up so you can grow in ways that you may not have been able to do.
Yeah. Earlier today, I was just in an experiential portion of an IFS
Okay.
training, and we were all working through an experiential idea of receiving feedback that things aren't going well from a client, and how important that is, because we're all going to receive feedback verbally or otherwise in our career. And to the point of this research that you're doing, what work have I done to be able to operate from a place that is helpful to the therapeutic relationship?
Yeah, I think it underscores it's kind of a two-sided coin here. It underscores the importance of us always being humble. Like we have to be humble in doing this work because we don't know everything. We're never going to know everything. I've been doing psychotherapy for over 40 years. I still get surprised, if not shocked at times, of what comes out in psychotherapy. And that's the joyful part of it. I mean, it's never a boring kind of experience, and so I'm always surprised by it. But it also means that, okay, I don't know everything. And so it's really useful to be humble in that fashion. So just to open yourself up to learning, we're still students, I think is probably the best way to think of it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Is there anything else that feels important to add as we?
I'll stop.
Okay. Thank you so much. The irony here, I was joking with my colleagues
Yes.
that the irony is that we're talking about perfectionism, and this is our second go of this because my imperfect connection interrupted our last conversation. So I thought that was kind of funny, but I do appreciate you joining me 2 times, and this has been such an illuminating conversation.
Well, you're a very good interviewer because you do something that not all interviewers do, is you actually listen carefully to what I say and then build on that. So it's probably because you're a therapist that you're such a good interviewer.
Oh, thanks. Sometimes I watch real interviewers and I think I really get into the weeds and
I think that's the important part, is you kind of follow where it's going, which those are the kind of interviews that I like to watch, is when it's a relational experience between the interviewer and the interviewee, that, okay, that's an interesting thing, as opposed to here's a series of questions to answer.
Oh, right. Well, thank you so much. I do appreciate that feedback. And of course, thank you for your time twice.
My pleasure. Okay.